Hi, friends. Welcome. Welcome to the session. We're so glad you're here. This is what colleges are looking for in 2024, because guess what? Tom and I have been spending a whole little bit of time, a whole lot of time actually, thinking about this. We've been doing a whole podcast series on what colleges want, and it's based on the State of College Admissions Report, which we'll get into in just a minute. But we've been thinking about this a lot, and we thought, wouldn't it be fun to sort of just distill some of this 9-episode podcast series that we are in the midst of into a session? And that's what today is. So that's what we're up to. Let me share my screen. And our check-in question is, what are you present to? Another version that we like to ask of this is, what's alive for you today? Feel free to let us know in the chat. And if you're just joining us, we've got a little poll there letting us know that, for example, we have right now 45% parents, 43% counselors, and 8% students. Cool. I'm going to hit share results on that so you can see what that is. So hi, welcome. We're glad you're here. So here are the beautiful slides that Tom has put together for us. Thank you, Tom. You're the best. They are beautiful. Don't even. They are beautiful. And here's what we're up to. Housekeeping stuff. Yes, it's being recorded, but you know somebody's going to ask, and you'll get an email with all the things. And captions are available at the bottom of your screen. If you got questions, we've got answers. Throw them into the chat, and our amazing moderator, Diana, will put them on a doc, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. We've got a live session survey poll that's going to pop into the chat in just a second. And that's separate from the poll you just took. And that helps us get to know who's here, what you want to know about, what we should do future sessions on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's a bad Yul Brynner. I realize that. That's a bad. But yay for musical theater references. What else? Oh, let's do a book giveaway. We're going to do a book giveaway at the end. I wrote this book a couple years back. It still, I think, holds up. Not too much has changed from when I wrote it, and we'll do a book giveaway at the end. So if you'll fill out that form, you'll get a chance to win. It's your chance to win. That's my voiceover voice. Here's what we're talking about today. We're talking about the factors that colleges deem most important. We're going to talk about briefly what is the State of College Admissions Report, and then we're going to get into the different factors. How do you know as a student, or if you're a parent or a counselor, how do you know to help students, which classes to take? What are these positive character attributes? This is something that popped onto the scene officially on the State of College Admissions Report this year. What are these, and how do you show these in your application? How important are essays really? And let's be honest. And who are they important for? We'll talk about demonstrated interest, a little bit on summer plans, a little bit on letters of recommendation, and standardized tests. What's shifted in standardized tests? Some of this stuff, if you're a counselor, will be stuff you know, but it's like, oh, it's nice to hear someone else say it. If you're a parent and you're kind of new to this process, some of it might be new, but hopefully we'll have lots of jokes and, I don't know, fun stuff in between. So even if it's stuff you know, it won't be so painful to hear. Okay, so here's the State of College Admissions Report. This is a snapshot from it. This was released in 2023. This report started 20 years ago. The first podcast I did with David Hawkins is a guy who started this report. But here's what you'll see, that the most important things are right here. High school GPA, if you look at the top, and the strength of high school curriculum. So it's like, are your grades awesome, and did you challenge yourself? And that didn't change from previous years. That's still what colleges give the most importance to. But some shifts are these things marked in red. So positive character attributes, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And the essays moved up a little bit. It used to be standardized tests were next. The essay has bumped up a little bit. You'll notice here, and this is just to show you can see how to read this chart, positive character attributes, 28% of the colleges surveyed gave considerable importance to it, and 37% gave moderate importance to it. And then underneath that, you'll see, essays, 19% give considerable importance, 37% moderate importance. And then underneath that, and this is the order that we're going to be covering these things in, demonstrated interest, counselor recommendations, teacher recommendations, extracurricular activities, then it's high school rank, which many schools don't track. Test scores jumped way down. Only now 4.9% give considerable importance to test scores. That's a big shift from years past. This was done I think this report was done sort of in the middle of the year of last year, if I remember correctly. And then portfolios, interviews, work experiences, exam scores, APs, IBs, sort of down the line. So this is a quick look at, actually, Tom, will you share just a little bit about what this was?
I'll kick it over. Sure, yeah. So hi, everyone. If you have not met me before, my name is Tom Campbell. Use he, him pronouns. My background's in college admissions and college counseling. So I spent 6 years total in admissions at Holy Cross and Pomona, and a year in independent school college counseling as well. So what this is here is kind of a progression of how some of these factors have changed over time based on the NACAC report. So as you can see here, two of the ones that we kind of wanted to highlight for your attention, just in terms of getting a sense of this new landscape in college admissions that's constantly evolving, and it's kind of hard to keep up with the pace of how things change. And even if you're a parent tuning in, for example, and you had kids who were going through this process, in 2019 to 2022, there's a big dip, in kind of how some of these factors have been taking shape, and how much weight they play on different colleges' application processes. The biggest one that we're going to touch on at the end of this presentation is particularly around standardized testing. So we'll give some recommendations on, the big, question, the elephant in the room is like to submit or not to submit, to be or not to be. It's not that deep. We're going to try to give as concrete advice as we can around that's as universal as possible, very well knowing that this can often be a very individualized conversation and choice. But as you can see, a lot of the other factors have remained pretty consistent, right? Courses, grades, as Ethan was mentioning, continue to be something that are the foot in the door at many colleges' admission process. Things like positive character attributes are not actually listed on this particular survey. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about that because it is the it's the new kid on the block when it comes to the NACAC report. And it's also admittedly pretty vague. Like, what are positive character attributes, right? Like, that could mean a lot of different things. There's a lot of attributes that we all possess, and what are like the most positive, right? And how much variance is there from school to school? So hopefully this gives you a sense of kind of the progression of how some things have ebbed and flowed over time. And I think the rest of what we'll cover definitely will give a little more color to that.
Yeah.
history.
And if just for those of you who are still looking at this and going, what do these numbers even mean? If you look at this, so the one highlighted in red here, for example, in 2018, 46% gave considerable importance to testing, and that's dropped to 5%, with this. Whereas if you look at something like, high school GPA, that's kind of, it was 82%, 79, 77% gave considerable importance. So that's kind of stayed pretty similar over the years. So, Tom, I'll kick it to you for how do I know which classes to take?
Sounds good. So we have a lot to cover today. So I'm going to give the macro level answer to this question that I know many of you will probably have follow-ups in the chat. And if you do, keep them coming because I'm there to answer as many as possible. But when it comes to academics, right, obviously, as you saw from the NACAC report, this is by far the biggest numerical value in terms of making yourself a competitive applicant at the broadest range of colleges and universities you possibly can. I've done a couple podcast episodes actually about this very topic. So if you want a lot more depth, I did an episode with our wonderful colleague, Susan Tree, who's been a college counselor for decades on the admission and the high school side, all about how colleges evaluate a student's academic record and what goes into that. And I also did an episode with Nitzia Cuevas Macias, which is all about GPA, course selection, particular recommendations for different subjects based on the advanced curriculum that you may have available in your own high school. But just in terms of some blanket generalized advice for those of you who are tuning in, it is important to remember that colleges do evaluate your academic record by and large on the context of what you have available to you. So I'm not going to be able to give, for example, a laundry list of like, here are all the recommended AP IB courses because every high school is very different. Some will have 5 AP courses, some will have 20, some will have none. Some will have the IB diploma, some will have their own advanced avant-garde, curriculum that teachers have developed within that own internal high school. So it's really difficult to give generalized advice about which courses every single student should take because also your strengths are different. The things that you're into are different. But in general, the biggest recommendation that we can give is to take all 5 solid academic courses that you see here on the screen, all 4 years, or the equivalent of all 4 years. So if, say, for example, maybe you took 2 science courses as a junior and you opted not to take one as a senior because you wanted to take 2 history instead or whatnot. The goal, your job, is to have 4 total full years of solid academic courses across these 5 core areas. The one area that you can see on the screen that is a little less, I'd say, expected by the broadest range of colleges and universities is languages. So sometimes students will either reach the highest level of Spanish or Mandarin or German, or, there's a lot of languages out there. There's some schools have the ASL, which is really cool. They might reach the maximum level that the school offers. And in that case, the colleges that are reading your transcript would not expect you to have any further courses beyond that. They might think it's cool if you took like maybe an intro level of another course you've never done before in language, but in general, that's the one where there's a little more wiggle room. I would say for any student who's tuning in, or parent or guardian advising students around course selection, I really highly recommend it's that delicate balance, right, of like exploring your curiosities and things that you're really into. And it can be difficult when you're like, hey, my high school graduation requirements are I only have to take 3 years of history, so I can't wait to be done because it's the worst subject. I don't feel that way personally because I was a history major and I think it's very interesting. I think it can inform a lot of different things, but I digress. That's something that I'd say it's a tough balance of wanting to encourage student autonomy while also knowing that if you have these end goals of a certain range of colleges in mind, you don't want to leave yourself non-competitive from the beginning by not taking advantage of doing all of these courses every year. So that's my biggest piece of advice around courses. If you want to go to the next slide, Ethan.
Got it.
Just a quick don't sweat it. I like to kind of organize tips around various parts of the college process into don't sweat it, which are things that, in my experience, people blow out of proportion in terms of concern and anxiety. And then I like to go into the don't forget it's of the things that I think people don't always pay as much attention to that often really help their candidacy. So for the don't sweat it's when it comes to choosing your classes, it's really important to try not to compare yourself to other students at other high schools that are not your own, because when an admissions officer is looking at the courses that are available to you, the questions that they're asking themselves are, what is available to you as a student based on your high school's offerings? And what did you leave on the table in terms of advanced course offerings that are there? This is mostly the way, especially more selective college admissions officers are thinking. So not every college out of the 2,000 plus that are out there for four-year colleges will be caring as much of how many AP classes you have, but people who come to college as a guide for support are generally interested in these more selective colleges because those are often the ones that have essays and, both personal statements and supplements. So we oftentimes try to give advice around that. And especially if you go with that bar, you're setting yourself up for success academically at the broadest range of colleges if you're taking and absorbing the advice for the more selective college route, because even schools that aren't as selective will still look at that favorably too. I think it's great also to not stress as much about worrying how hard your school is, because again, a lot of college, the person who's reading your application will have access to a document called the school profile, as well as information from your high school college counseling team about the courses that are available in your community, maybe some barriers when it comes to, our school has limits on how many AP classes students can take. So those are all things that oftentimes students really worry about, especially if they have friends or neighbors who go to a school where there's more courses offered. It's completely apples and oranges. Their process is not relevant to your own, and no admissions officer will be comparing you to them and their academic offerings. And then the next one is just some real quick don't forget it's. And what I would say here for this one, if you want to just go to the next slide, my fair friend Ethan, is to try and balance your interests with your capacity, right? So again, if you're really interested in computer science, right, and you want to take a lot of courses in STEM, that's great. I'd say try to make sure not to neglect the other areas, because colleges still do want to see that too, even if it's not your main thing. They want to see they're open to different ideas and experiences, and potentially that you can make connections between your main hustle, your main squeeze, your academic, superpower, and a broader range of academic skills that a broad, liberal arts high school experience across the board will really ensure for you. I also really want to put out a recommendation around prioritizing core academic classes over specialized career-based classes. A lot of high schools offer really cool classes and things like, anatomy and physiology, and ones that are a little more oriented towards a particular career. That's actually not something that I would say should take or replace the core foundational academic solid courses. So in science, biology, chemistry, and physics should generally, for most students, be prioritized over maybe some more admittedly like sexier titles or courses that seem really cool. Maybe you can take that as an elective course. You can take that in addition to the core solids. But in general, for the widest range of colleges, they would prefer to see the core courses because you'll have time to specialize when you get on their campus and dive into those more nuanced and detailed courses. And then the last real tip with this is I would say, pay attention to in-state flagship school requirements. So if you're a student who's coming from California, for example, there's a whole series of courses called the A through G requirements that any high school student in California is basically, the high school is set up to be that way. But if you're a student outside of California and you're like, oh, I didn't know I need to take 2 years of art, visual and performing, or otherwise, to be an eligible applicant for the University of California system, it is good to be aware of some of the course requirements that different colleges offer, because it's not always one size fits all. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Okay, and the last one here that I want to touch on is if there's ever any things that you're like, but wait, I couldn't take this course because the teacher was pregnant and it wasn't offered my junior year and da 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 da. You have a space to do that in your college application. It's called the additional information section. And it's basically a blank slate for you to be able to explain any challenges that you may have had if you were sick with mono, sophomore year, or you had to change schools. So it impacted the courses you could register for that had certain prerequisites. There is a space for you to kind of talk about maybe some of the particularities of your own academic journey. So just know that that's something that we highly recommend doing if you have concerns about the way your transcript will be read and evaluated. And there was some bumps along the road that don't have the seamless all A transcript. That is, guess what? Most students don't have exactly that. So just want to put a plug out there for that self-advocacy through the additional information section. Okay, so the next category in the report beyond the academic buckets is this elusive positive character attributes quality. So something that the first couple slides, I actually find there to be like a real interesting kind of tension here, because a lot of the things that I just mentioned on the first slide really do ramp up what many of you may be experiencing in your various school communities, which is this big, especially for students applying to selective colleges, a very tumultuous achievement-based culture that many students and families are trying to navigate, and balancing college aspirations and wanting to be the most impressive academic student with some of the advice that I mentioned before, with prioritizing balance and wellness, and a whole kind of broader range of skills and qualities that you're developing beyond exclusively the classroom. Colleges, I think, have a little bit of they want their cake and eat it too attitude, right? Like they're looking for a certain level of academic achievement in conjunction with other contributions to their various campus communities outside of academics. And of course, there's ways to show that with formalized activities, and we'll get into that in a few slides. But in general, the way that colleges are starting to evaluate candidates increasingly more and more is by looking through their application and identifying particular positive character attributes that they associate with the ideal student body or the college campus and community that they are trying to craft increasingly as they grow into the future. So this quote that you see on the right side of the screen is from a book called Excellent Sheep by William Deresiewicz. I should just listen to the name.
Deresiewicz? I think it's Deresiewicz.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is it kind of describes, I think, some of the pain point that many of these colleges are seeing when it comes to students who are coming in and being very tunnel visioned around solely academics and grades, and completely thinking about their identity in those terms. So colleges are active to see evidence of areas outside of exclusively academics, while that still is the foot in the door of their admission process. So what are some examples of these positive character attributes? You may be wondering. We have answers. So if you go to the next slide, Ethan, first I want to make a plug for the wonderful Making Caring Common project. If you're interested in this topic around positive character attributes outside of exclusively academic achievement, this is something that this initiative out of the Harvard Graduate School of Education eats, sleeps, and breathes, and has been doing since 2013. There was a particular surge in 2016 with something called the Turning the Tide admissions report, where 150 plus different colleges and universities signed on saying basically what I just mentioned in the previous slide, which is, hey, we're really struggling with having these students come in with a completely tunnel vision mentality, and these other areas of being a great contributor to society, which is really fundamental to our mission as higher education institutions, are not being seen with the same weight or light or being validated as much. So we want to modify ways in our admissions process and communicate explicitly to students and families that these things matter too. So if you go to the next slide, Ethan. One of the best ways to get a sense for what these positive character attributes are is going to be looking at different colleges' mission and vision statements. These are actually also called foundational documents. So Ethan, if you want to go to the, oh, there it is. Okay. So individual colleges often cite their own foundational documents as the primary sources for how they decided what are positive character attributes to that particular school. But as you start to research different colleges and you read lots of different mission statements, you'll see that there's a lot of similar qualities that they're looking for in students. To give a little bit of an analogy of like other aspects of society that use this same format of using foundational documents to kind of be the pillars of how they're organized and how they, evolve, and what's still rooting them after all this time is our very own United States of America. Even though many people at College Guy tune in from around the world, we do serve the bulk of the people who we serve do come from the U.S. And the foundational documents that the U.S. was kind of built off of are the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And some of those are evolving documents, right? Constitution, there can be new amendments that come here and there. It's the same thing with colleges and universities. So they have foundational documents like the charter from the very first person who stepped on campus, the plot of land in 1850 and staked their claim, usually in a problematic way. And then they're trying to evolve as a school and continue to release strategic visions for the growth of the school in the future, continue to adapt and modify their own mission statement for modern times, as well as the board of trustees, that is a really governing body at different colleges that are coming together, as a group of different constituents to see, hey, what are we seeing on our various campuses and what are some qualities that we want to see more of in students going forward? Those are all ways that colleges kind of basically put together for lack of a better word, like the rubric of which types of qualities they're keeping an eye out for in students' applications. So a few examples of this, if you go to the next slide. One that I kind of wanted just to underscore is that as students kind of start to put together their college list, you will notice if you start to research different college mission statements, which I highly recommend you do for every school you apply to. And if you have like a Google Sheet with all the schools you're applying to, it's a great idea to put a column that has different mission statements for colleges. So that way, the specific things that they're citing are important to them. So the two schools I wanted to point out here that have a little bit of a distinction, I would say, are Pitzer College and Yale University. I would argue that Pitzer gives students a little more clear-cut guidance about what their special values or positive character attributes are, because they're explicitly mentioning things like environmental sensitivity, intercultural understanding, social justice, meaningful participation in the college's governance and the way that they operate. Those are all some pretty specific calls to action or ways that Pitzer has kind of adopted or evolved as a school. Yale's, on the other hand, I'd say is one that, as you start to read different mission statements, you'll notice a lot of similar language and similar values that colleges are looking for. In a way that's comforting, because it's nice to know that, like, by and large, the majority of schools that I'm looking at are valuing similar things. But it can be also helpful to find more distinctive qualities. If you read a mission statement that's a little generalized, there are often those other foundational documents that I mentioned on the previous screen that can give a little more clarity about particular things that certain schools are looking for more in students. If you want to go to the next couple slides, we can just run through this pretty quickly, but just wanted to give a few examples of colleges that explicitly put on their website particular values and qualities that they're looking for in students. And as someone who used to read applications, I would go and I had to note, Pomona also has their valued qualities listed on their website. One of them is like probing inquiry and creative learning. So for students who had, what does that mean, right? So for students who had examples of like creative ways of thinking or making connections between different academic disciplines, or just like going real ham with like their Wikipedia rabbit holes, at 3 a.m. and they write about that in their essays, those would be examples for me as an admissions officer to say, this student is possessing probing inquiry and creative learning. As you saw from the slide from Swarthmore, they have similar things that they're looking for in students. And it will, again, really depend on the individual college and their mission and values and how they've evolved as a school, how they see themselves.
By the way, for folks who are listening who are like, oh, I don't have time to read all these or screenshot them, there is a blog post that we will link you to that has all of this information. And shout out to Susan, who's on the call right now, for helping us pull these together and write that post.
Yes. So here's another one from Bennington, just as another example. So again, some similarities as you saw from Swarthmore, but again, each college kind of has distinctions depending on their history. The next one, just wanted to give two tech-based examples. So places like MIT, I want to point particular attention to that bottom one on the right, the ability to prioritize balance. I'd say a lot of STEM-based schools in particular are really concerned about students who are staying up till 3 a.m. every day and not sleeping for the sake of STEM, right? And so if there's evidence of a student in their application maybe falling more into that end of the spectrum, it can often be more difficult for the admissions officer working at MIT to advocate for that student. Another example from a tech-based school will be Georgia Tech. So on the next slide, you'll see some of the values that they've explicitly put as well on their admission website that students, they're looking for, particularly in students. Ethan, I know you sat down with a few folks in this space for your own podcast recording on this topic.
Yeah.
So on the next slide, I don't know if I think this is the last one with positive
This is
character
the last
attributes,
one, I
but
think, on this
yeah.
one. And then
Anything else to touch on?
yeah,
Or
I'd love to just say two words about this. So I talked with two folks, two guys, well, three, Tom Bear and Bob Massa, who've been doing this for a long time and who've been part of this. It's really a movement to help colleges think through what they're looking for. It's so funny. We spend so much time as counselors, as parents, helping students to think about what they're looking for. Colleges, in some cases, need help thinking through that. So it was neat to talk to them. And then I talked with Tricia Ross Anderson from the Harvard Making Caring Common Project to talk about, and they shared a couple of rubrics that colleges use when they're actually looking for things. And of course, there's going to be somebody on the session who's like, can you just give me the answer, like the answer key for like, what is every college looking for? And the truth is with these positive character attributes that there is no like top 10 things colleges are looking for. I mean, there are certain things that when you do this long enough, you go, yeah, most colleges are looking for curious students. Most colleges are looking for like something like intellectual value, but there's not like a top 10. And one of the things we talk about on the podcast is like, that's probably a good thing because suddenly all of these like businesses would pop up around like how to show name the thing in your application, and it would become gamified and probably, create more inequity in the process. So it's actually maybe kind of good that all that information isn't out there and that it's not all the same things. Although for folks who really want the answer, I imagine it's somewhat maddening. But it is as it is, as it is. So I think if for those of you who are interested in this and who are kind of excited to like, hear more about what is this, what are colleges looking for and like what is it like to help guide, whatchamacallit, guide, um, like what is it like to see it from that college perspective? I'd welcome you to check that one out. Let's see. Let me share. Oh, there were a couple other slides here that I'll just name briefly, and then we'll talk about essays a little bit. But some of these positive character attributes, where do you show these? One of the things we talked about in the podcast is where do you actually show these things? And it's in places like the recommendation letters where you can have someone speak on your behalf, in the personal statement, your college essay, so to speak, where you can say, here are the qualities that I think are important to me. And oh, by the way, that, align with your institution. The additional information section is one that we're not going to spend a ton of time on today, because that's more when we kind of get into like college application land later in the year. We'll talk more about what goes there. But that's a place essentially where you can talk about all kinds of things, extenuating circumstances, courses that you took or weren't able to take and you wanted to just explain a little bit more. And then supplemental essays, of course, those for those of you who may not know, those are those essays that, many students, if you're applying to private schools, you'll write one big personal statement that'll go out to many schools, and then specific schools will have specific essays. So Michigan's like, why do you want to go to Michigan? And, Stanford's like, what's one thing you're going to, take advantage of while you're on campus? In some cases, because not everybody offers it, you've got the interviews. A few schools, a small handful, are doing video responses. And then sometimes you can use that activities list, aka your brag sheet, to talk about those positive character attributes and show responsibility, show your curiosity, show your ambition and your drive. So that can be a cool place to consider. Speaking of MIT, quick plug, because next week we've got Carlos Vega, Senior Assistant Director of Admissions from MIT, and Hillary, who came up to me at NACAC, the national conference this past year, and was like, I love your resources. And I was like, sweet, do you want to do a webinar sometime? And she's like, great, email me. So they're coming on next week to sort of really provide that college admission officer perspective. And in the initial email that you've got, so you can search for Carlos or Hillary in your email, you'll see a little place where you can submit a form. And if you've got any questions for them, you can put them there. I'm sure we're going to have a bunch, and I'm going to try to do my best synthesizing. But just a quick mid-session commercial for next week's session. I hope you'll join us for that. I figured it was kind of appropriate because we're talking about MIT. All right, essays. Look at me. I'm like rubbing my hands together. Essays. If you're a junior, this is not a time to be working on your college essay. I'll give you a timeline in just a minute. But just to kind of zoom back and give you a sense of What, how important are these things? It depends on the school. And this is something that David Hawkins talked about in the first podcast episode, where he said basically, these essays tend to be more important for more selective schools. So if we're talking about a less selective college, which is to say greater than 50% admit rate, what they're looking for here is skills, qualities, values, and interests that you're going to bring to the campus. Now, that's going to be true across the board. The colleges are all looking for that. But as we think about more like highly selective schools, so on the top of your or on the right of your screen, it's what are those uncommon skills and qualities that are going to help set you apart from all the other students who have awesome grades and maybe some good test scores and awesome extracurriculars. In terms of, another thing that's sort of true across the board is they're looking for new information. What beyond the numbers am I learning about you that's going to help contribute to your candidacy? That's going to help me as an admission reader make an informed decision about the application. So we're looking for new information. And then we're looking for, can the student write and coherently in English, as is one way of putting it, but just sort of like, can the student communicate their thoughts clearly? When it comes to selective schools, they are wondering also, am I compelled by this? Is there something that's drawing me in? And highly selective schools, is there something that, is there evidence that there is, connection with our institutional priorities? So we're not going to spend a ton of time today talking about institutional priorities, but that's essentially the things that we're looking for as a college. And do I see those present? Because as Tom will tell you on a previous podcast episode, whatever, a couple of years ago, that's a big thing that gets discussed in committee when they're in that room and they're kind of having a conversation about this student versus that student, and they're down to like, okay, we've got 6 spots left or 20 spots left. They're oftentimes looking at sort of, shaping the class with these institutional priorities. So future webinar, we'll get more into those. In terms of a timeline, just to give you a sense, because I don't want you to feel like you have to be doing all the things, everything, everywhere, all at once. Now through April, if you want to get into some light brainstorming on essays, we've got a whole bunch of resources I'll share with you. But really, this is not the time to be like, I got to finish this. These aren't due, if you're applying to college until really the end of the year. I would say the best time to start working on these is May, June, when we finished APs up, or if you're taking APs and finished finals, and that start of right before summer starts, gets kicked off, you've got a little window there where it's such a great time that I think to begin thinking about this so that you can kind of marinate on these over the summer. But I think July, August is really that time to be working on your personal statement, your brag sheet, your activities list, additional info, and to really start your supplemental essays. And my hope is that once those supplemental essays are released, which is usually in August, that you've kind of got a good chunk of your work done on your common application, which is going to be the application that you'll submit to, or that a student will submit, and mostly parents on the call, so that your student will submit, that there's like a lot of work done. So I tell students, like, just in your mind, just go, okay, I'm going to spend a few hours each week this summer working on college applications. Some students want to spend 2 hours, some want to spend 10 and really just get it done. I want you to get, I tell students, as much done as possible. So when you walk back in fall, all your friends are stressing out because they're just getting started. And I'm like, you're done. Like, you've mostly got the work done so that you can submit stuff. Mostly, hopefully all your stuff have it done by November, ideally sort of before that Halloween time, so that November, December can be a little bit more relaxed. That's, best laid schemes, of course. But we've got a guide that Diana will share in the chat. That's our free guide to the personal statement. I'd love for you to check this out, and especially like check it out, send it to students when they're ready, when you feel like they're ready, so they can begin to start doing a couple different exercises. They're pretty simple, and it's got sample essays and stuff on structuring in there. So is there anything else, Tom? Or we've got so much to cover. I'm thinking we zoom along. Does that sound good to you?
I say the train keeps rolling.
Let's do it.
Colleges are still open. People are still applying. So the
true.
next category we're going to touch on, which is actually pretty high on the NACAC report of the state of college admissions, what factors hold the most weight report. That's not the official name, but you get what I mean. Is demonstrated interest. So what this means essentially is these are documented touch points that a student has with a particular college or university. And we'll give a list. We have a list of examples of what that looks like in just 2 slides from now. But essentially, for anyone tuning in, students, families, counselors, this is something that a decent bulk of colleges and universities do care about. I'd say generally, the more selective a college gets, and this is, again, a generalization, not I don't want to say this and have to be like, this guy told me that. Blah, blah, blah. Generally, the more selective the school gets, the less demonstrated interest is a big factor in their admission process. And typically the reason why that is because a lot of those schools are schools where they have an applicant pool of people who will be clamoring at the gates to go to those schools. It's an easy sell. The majority of colleges and universities in the US are competing for students more so than having this, 80% of students who are admitted will attend the school if they're admitted. That is a very high, what's called a yield rate, the number of students who accept the actual offer of admission. So schools will utilize tools like demonstrated interest to try and really sort out students who are actually interested in possibly attending versus ones that maybe just threw the app in there kind of at the last minute or without much thought. It was like, oh, my counselor told me I needed to have a more balanced list, so I'll just throw one in here at this school. And generally, it's those schools actually that are maybe more likelies or target schools for a student that do tend to actually keep an eye and a pulse on demonstrated interest and what that looks like. So on the next slide, you'll see an example of where you can find whether or not a school does measure this. This is something that I would say colleges are very transparent about from my experience. Is whether or not they actually do care about demonstrated interest. Speaking as someone who worked at a school that cared a lot about it, Holy Cross, and a school that didn't care about it at all, Pomona, our messaging around that was very honest and transparent with students about ways you could put your best foot forward. At Holy Cross, we really encourage students to do interviews or visit campus if they had the ability to, if they were close by. At Pomona, we told them we don't look at demonstrated interest. We don't bring it up in committee. And from my experience working there for 4 years, that was the case. That said, even at highly selective schools, you can still make a positive impression on the admissions officer who is reading your file. So demonstrated interest, in my opinion, is something that is a good practice to start to fold out, regardless of if you are really, really crossing your fingers and hoping for those more elite schools that don't tend to care quite as much about it. But if you look at each school's common data set, you will see whether or not they consider demonstrated interest. It's the last bullet usually on the chart that each school will have. And it will say level of an applicant's interest. Any school that has, I'd say, considered or higher is one where you do want to take advantage of some of the opportunities that they provide to students directly through the admissions office. So it doesn't count as demonstrated interest if, oh, my friend who I met at Little League 10 years ago, goes to this school and we had a great old chat and I think it sounds great. The school won't know about that if you don't tell them that. So maybe you can mention that as supplemental essay or whatnot, but again, it has to be a documented interaction with the school. Otherwise, the person reading your file will have no evidence to present to their colleagues that you actually have done research on the school and know a thing or two about it in that capacity. So the next slide.
Tom,
Yeah.
let me say a quick fun fact. There's a moment in the podcast where Christine was like, do you want to actually see what colleges see behind the scenes? So we have a little video. So when the podcast gets released, where you can actually see inside Slate and look at what are all those documented interactions. And you can see a student track for, I think it's from like 8th grade on, for those of you who are curious to see the behind the curtain. So anyway.
Yeah. And I would say I'm seeing, some questions in the chat about do you have to email every admissions officer or every school you apply to? And, hey, we're busy people. There's a lot of elements of this college process, like how much in the ratio of a pie chart of a week in the life of Tom should cold calling, admissions offices be my job. I don't want this to be the end all be all for you as a student and family. I think that especially being wise and strategic about, looking at your college list, taking a look at their common data set information to see whether or not they do measure and, track demonstrated interest. If that's a part of their process, they will usually tell you, and then make a plan accordingly to maybe visit some of the schools that do consider it. Sometimes students will wait, for example, to visit schools that they know they're already going to apply to, they know they're already excited about, and the school doesn't measure demonstrated interest. Maybe you can wait to see if you're admitted there and do an admitted student day event instead, right? And prioritize, those more high touch interactions for the schools where it actually makes a difference in your candidacy, right? So all these examples that you see here on the list and on the screen here, we have blog guides that go into a lot more depth and the podcast that Ethan mentioned to describe kind of what they all are. A few that I'll just point out real quick are things like fly-in programs. So if you're a family that's concerned about affording campus visits and you don't have a lot of money for that, many colleges put on programs for students from lots of different diverse backgrounds to be able to learn more about that college campus and receive funding to go on these programs. And virtual visits are another great way too, right? You don't have to visit a campus physically. The pandemic required a lot of admissions officers to get really crafty and put together some really awesome virtual tour opportunities. I think some are better than others. I made the one at Pomona, which I think was really great. I walked around with my iPhone and recorded the entire campus tour that a student would do. and had little interactive like mascot moving around the campus on a map. So there is a spectrum. It depends on how enticing the programming is from the college, but a lot of slew of options that colleges have out there to explore them in a more formal way.
Summertime and the living is easy. So how and when should you be making summer plans? It's wild, but here I am, a parent, 9-year-old, and I just literally got texts before this session about what's happening this summer from my daughter's parents' friends. It's happening. It's the plans are happening. Some of you already know this. I'm preaching to the choir here, but I'm not going to say it's never too early because I do think it is too early. But when it comes to thinking about summer, I don't think now is a bad time. And I think I would have kind of been like, psh, years ago before I became a parent, but it's a thing. These summer programs sometimes, fill up. But there are so many ways to to spend your summer. If you're watching this recording months from now and you're like, oh my gosh, it's too late. It's not too late. There's so many awesome ways to do this. We've got a a whole guide on this for different ways to spend your summer. And know that there's not like some secret thing that colleges are like, if you do this, then you'll get in. You're going to get into Penn if you do the Penn summer program. Like, that's just not the way this works. So don't feel that necessarily, if you're a parent watching this, that those like fancy programs that cost anywhere from, just thousands and thousands of dollars are going to necessarily be like the difference maker. A good thing to consider is thinking about, how am I continuing the things that I'm already into? And what are you doing to show what we like to call self-direction? How are you taking your learning into your own hands and creating opportunities for yourself? We're all about values, yes, but we're all about concrete exercises at CEG. So here's a quick little exercise. And let's just, parents and counselors, let's just do this too for funsies. So here's one of our go-to exercises, our values list. And I'm gonna, grow it here a little bit. Diana, maybe you could throw the link in if you wouldn't mind. So take a look at this for a second, and I want everybody to do this. I want you to pick, let's say, two values that you are excited to bring into your life this summer. Okay. Take a look at this. Two values you're excited to bring into your life this summer. Scrolling down here. And for each one, I want you to think of one thing you could do to bring each of those values into your life. So 30-second brainstorm, two values, and share in the chat if you would be willing to. What's a thing you could do, and yes, students, parents, counselors, to bring this value more into your life? So if it's travel, what experience could you have around travel? And there might be even a value underneath travel that you're wanting to bring into your life. What would you do to bring that into your life? Beauty, for example. Well, how could you bring more beauty into your life? And get as specific as you can, so if it's like nature, like what experience could you have with nature? Where could you go? I'm going to read a couple of these. Freedom and quiet, by not signing my kids up for activities and camps and allowing us to just enjoy the time at home. Heart emojis for that one. I love it. Creativity, take floral arrangement classes. Yes. Gratitude, put my damn phone down and read more. I love it. I love it so much. You're getting lots of heart emojis from that. I just did a video on self-care where I talked about my own relationship with my phone. Maybe, Diana, you could link to that. And some particular practices that I've done to help me, in your words, put my damn phone down. So with you on that. Oh, this is lovely. Gratitude, telling someone each day that I'm thankful for them or something I'm grateful for. A fun fact, Autumn, is I have a little daily gratitudes thread with two of my best friends, and each day I do just that. I check in with something that I'm grateful for. The thing that I checked in today was that I was grateful that I did the dishes last night so that when I woke up this morning, I had a clean kitchen. So this simple exercise can be a compass for you. I know that maybe for some of you, this is kind of basic, but it's like you can plan your summer based on the things that you want to bring into your life. So I offer this, and if you're a parent listening to this, you're like, it might be a way in. I don't know if this is a way in with your kids, but what do you want to bring into your life? And then concretely, how do we do that? Because to me, this is connected oftentimes to our deeper needs. Like, what are the needs that you're hoping to fulfill? What are, my friend Aaron would say, what are you calling in to your life? So I offer that as a little exercise. Here's from Everything Summer. They put out this report a little while back about how much do colleges value different things. Certainly, colleges feel that internships and independent research are really important, but there are all sorts of things that are important. Community service, arts, theater, music, language and study and, travel and academic programs. So all of these things are valuable. And notice it's not within a huge range. It's within sort of like a 50 to 70% range of how colleges value these. So we did the exercise. You already shared in the chat, so I can skip this one. I know this is a lot, y'all. We're doing it all today. We're doing it all. Tom, letters of rec, go.
I'm going to go through this really quickly because I know there's not a ton of students that are on this session. But essentially, in terms of securing great letters of recommendation, something that I like to put out there in terms of like the way that someone in admissions, where recommendations can be helpful, is oftentimes the counselor letter is kind of seen as like a secondary source. It's usually a compilation of the student's own survey responses. If their school gives like a thing that's like, oh, tell us more about you and your activities and let us get to know you more. A lot of high schools offer that as a way for the college counselor to get to know the student as much as possible. And then the teacher is someone, it's a primary source, right? It's someone who's like being like, hey, my name's Tom. I was the teacher in history for this student. And here are all the things I saw them do and rockstar achievements or areas where I really saw them in their stride or areas where they've grown from my own lens and my own vantage point. So that tends to be the distinction between these two letters, which are often parts of many different schools' forms of advocacy. So on the next slide, you'll see just some tips around things that you want to maybe consider when you're thinking about which teachers to ask for letters of recommendation. If you're a student tuning into this call, I actually recommend starting to think about this sooner than later. So that way you're not like springing a recommendation request like, the week before your college deadline is due. Sometimes that does happen. So ideally you want to give teachers a lot of time ahead of time and a lot of information from the get-go about things that you would love to hear articulated about you in the letter. You don't have to be like, I'm writing the letter for you, here it is. But oftentimes teachers really appreciate the student giving them some basically kind of like a sheet of things that they particularly got out of their class, projects that they worked on that were really exciting for them, or they really like pushed past the standard expectations. So that's something that I think to really keep in mind when you're thinking about who to ask. Next slide.
I wonder, Tom, because we've got 10 minutes, if we could zip forward to standardized tests for a couple minutes, and then we'll kind of, because I want to leave time for Q&A. Is that cool?
Yeah, rec letters.
So rec letters, get them. They're awesome. We've got a whole guide. Google college essay guide recommendation letters, and you'll see a whole big guide on that. Standardized tests. What happened? Some of you counselors know about this, but essentially, more than 2,000 schools now don't require tests anymore. And why is this? In many cases, concerns around equity and opportunity. You could totally go through this process and not take standardized tests, but having said that, it's valuable to consider it. Why? A few reasons, but essentially, let me say it this way. I like the way Akil Bello puts it. I'm going to stop showing this screen for a second. You don't have to decide today if you're going to submit your standardized test scores. Essentially, there are these different choice points along the way. This is Akil talking here, separate webinar. But he's like, you have to decide, am I going to prep or not? So you can decide that, if you're, say, a junior in this process. And then once you prep, you decide, okay, am I going to prep some more? Am I going to actually take the test now? You can decide that. Then you can decide, am I going to take the test again? But it's not until way later that you decide, am I actually going to submit the score? So know that, and I think that can help hopefully to reduce stress. You don't necessarily have to do this. Can they help in some cases and for certain schools? Yeah, having an awesome test score can totally, show that intellectual vitality, show that sense of like, yes, I'm smart, and it shows other things too, like, well, I won't get into that, but I have a whole podcast coming out on this with Jay Rosner, some of you know from the Princeton Review Foundation, and in short, you could go through this process without testing, but you don't have to decide right now. That's kind of the high level version of it. A few colleges still care about them: Georgia Tech, MIT, Georgetown, Dartmouth. You've got a quote here.
Just a few examples, by the way. This is not exhaustive.
Yeah. In our high volume, globally this was a big thing in the college admissions world, by the way. Heterogeneous applicant pool in which most candidates are high achievers. I'm going to skip ahead. high school performance and testing, when taken together, offer the most robust framework for predicting success at Dartmouth. All scores are assessed through that local framing as we seek excellence from new geographies. So what they're, I think, saying there is like, hey, we're looking at these test scores in the context of the student's whole application. If you've got a test score that's a middle 50%, a great one to, this is a great go ask your counselor question, because your counselor will have a great sense of what other students have submitted from your school and what other students, from your school have been likely to be accepted. Just a quick plug, students, talk to your counselors. They want to talk to you. They are excited to talk to you. They love you. They want you. This is their job. Ask them questions, connect with them. I know there are lots of counselors on the call, but this is for parents to, like, talk to your counselors, ask them questions, because they are there for you. And it could be the smallest thing or the biggest thing. But all right, coming up, this is sort of like in the commercials of like what's coming up in college essay guy land. We've already released a few episodes of this podcast series. We've released 3 of them, in fact. One sort of setting up what is the state of college admissions report. The second one, we talked about grades. The third one, and course rigor. The third one, we talked about positive character attributes. And then coming soon, Tom and I shot a long video so it's going to be a podcast and a video up in my house on the personal statement and then the supplemental essays. Then we get into demonstrated interest, crash course and rec letters for students, and one for counselors. Tom did one with Carolyn on extracurriculars, and then there's one that I recorded last year actually with Jay on standardized testing. So those are all coming up. So stay tuned to the podcast. If this was a YouTube video, I'd say smash that like button. I don't think you can smash a like button for a podcast, but I hope you like it because we spent a lot of time on it. Counselors, and this is again in the commercials land. Some folks don't know that we do workshops, but we do workshops. If you'd like College Essay Guy to come to your school, we would super love to come. We do workshops on all kinds of things: personal statement, supplemental essays. We do stuff on the UCs, University of California, schools, and lots of PDs for counselors and English teachers. So we'll share a link on that in the chat. If you're interested, I got off a call with Hannah earlier today. You can book a call with her. She's really amazing, and as a former English teacher and avid teacher, is really good at. We just did another session today with a group of counselors on helping people figure out their essay workshop plan. So if you're trying to figure out your essay workshop plan, you're looking for a thinking buddy, reach out. And then we also do one-on-one stuff. Some people know this, some people don't, but this process can be complicated. It can be difficult. And so we have one-on-one support. Again, Diana will share a link to this, where students can work with coaches. I've got an awesome team that I've worked with for years and years. And the good news is we support students whether you can pay for support or whether you can't. We've got an amazing cohort of volunteer community that supports students for no cost. You get free essay help. So we'll share links to both of those. And yeah, would love to connect with you, whether you have 0 budget or a budget. What else? I think that's it. I think that's all the slides. We've got time for some questions, and we might stay over a few minutes here because I think we didn't hit record until later. So maybe we'll stay over 5 minutes. So we'll spend at least 10 minutes here on questions. And at some point, we won't post the form again. We'll just take the folks who filled out the form earlier. We'll give away a free book here in about 9 or 10 minutes. But we'd love to invite you to, if you have questions, please feel free to share questions in the chat. Let us know what you're thinking about. Tom, jump.
One link I'm going to share just right now in the chat is
AI. We'll talk about AI. Go ahead.
People talk about AI. Yeah. Is a blog that's literally titled "What Colleges Want." And a lot of it actually is a breakdown of the report that we all just went through in this webinar. But if you want a physical written testimonial, it was actually written by myself, my colleagues Renee Ferrerio and Morgan Phillips. We're the part of the college counseling team at College Essay Guys, so we help with elements of the college process beyond exclusively essays. So it's a really great read. If you don't like podcasts as much, if you think the tenor of my voice is annoying, whatever, so be it. You can just read and you put on some other voice in your head of the wisdom.
So AI, and I'll let you tee up maybe a couple questions behind the scenes, Tom, while I'm talking about AI. So AI is pretty amazing. It can do some pretty incredible things. And there was a Duke recently came out and they said that they're not going to assign a score to essays anymore, that they're going to be looking at it. It sounds like more holistically. So it sounds like they are still using them in the process, but they're just not assigning a particular like numerical value in the process. So my sense with AI is that we're still kind of in the early phases of this. And it's kind of amazing when I've talked to more than probably 30 different admission officers about AI as in the last year around this, it's still like they're not quite sure what to make of it. And an interesting thing happened where AI came out and it was sort of like our essay is going to go away. And, because, they can't know if a student has written it or not. And there was that question. And then after the Supreme Court decision to sort of ban race conscious admissions, not sort of to ban race conscious admissions, the essays are really important. So I think colleges, if I have to sort of take the position of colleges for a minute, it's kind of a conundrum moment. So they're sort of going, well, we want to get this information from students. Students can potentially use AI in certain situations, but there's still information that we need from. So what do we do? And that's sort of the sense that I get. And the word that I'm hearing from colleges so far is like essays aren't going away. But what I'll say on the AI from the AI front, I think there are some really interesting potential uses of it. And one of the cool uses that I think is that you can use AI is you can use it to ask you interesting questions. So if you're like annoyed by the sound of my voice, you can actually have AI ask you questions like, hey, if I'm brainstorming a personal statement, what questions would you ask me? And you can just see what pops up. And I think it's pretty fun and interesting to see one of the ways that you can use this essentially large language model to get you thinking and get you, creative. There are ways that I would say what I want to say to students, I want to caution you against copying and pasting stuff. Please don't copy and paste stuff from AI into your actual essay for a few reasons. One is that, ethical concerns, ethical questions. Two, colleges may ask you if you did, and you want to be able to answer that. And three, and this is kind of the deeper one, I feel like if AI were to become really prevalent and many students were using AI, I think there's like and I'm kind of preaching to the choir when it comes to the counselors here. I think there is I want to call it like a nutritional value in this process, where for students going through a reflective process of asking deep questions, figuring out who you are, figuring out what you care about, and how do you put that into language that can communicate the wide range and depths of who you are. Like that to me is why I do this work. And I think that if we're using AI to basically prompt, as it were, those processes and that kind of depth of self-reflection, I'm like such a fan of it. I think where I start to get a little nervous is when students sort of use it as a shortcut. Uh, Now, having said that, I may be sounding old-fashioned already because it certainly shortcuts a lot of things. But I think I would be really sad kind of looking ahead if that's the way that it, comes to be used. But I think we're all still learning together, and I think it's really early to know. So I think it's kind of too soon to tell. I think there are some really cool applications, but I hope that students will still go through that deep process of like learning and growing. So I don't know if that's satisfying to you all. I welcome even more specific questions on AI if you've got them, and we can talk about this. I'm sure we'll be talking about this on future webinars. Tom, what do you got? What other questions popped up from folks?
Well, I mean, if I can go ahead and just screen share the list that we have and kind of run through as many as possible. I don't know if that's an effective way to.
Let's, I mean, you want to, yeah, sharpshoot a few of them, do a few, and then great, do
Sure.
it.
Yeah. All right. So, um, Michelle's asking, what do we need to do if we need to appeal the financial aid office because of special circumstances? Most financial aid offices won't do anything to April. Unfortunately, there's nothing to do until they're open and available to receive your questions. So you have to wait until financial aid staffing at different colleges are available if you do want to appeal your process, which, by the way, anyone who's tuning in, you can appeal your financial aid package. It's totally legitimate and very much something that you can do as part of your financial aid process. There's no guarantee that they'll give you more money, but it never hurts to try.
I'll take one. Look, maybe we'll ping
Yeah.
pong back and forth. We probably
Sure.
won't get through all of them, everybody, by the way, but we're going to kind of do questions that we feel like might be most relevant to most folks. So one of the questions on here is, how do you get kids comfortable with self-promotion? And Susan answered this a little bit, but what I'll say is like, I think it takes practice. And I think it also takes, and what I mean by practice is like having students talk about themselves, like asking them questions. But I think specifically like letting them know that there are parts of the application where you will self-promote and parts where you don't necessarily need to self-promote. So you will self-promote in the activities list, but you don't necessarily need to self-promote, as it were, in the personal statement. So know that there are places for it and places that necessarily you don't need to do it.
Yeah. Few other ones here. One I saw here is how important is demonstrated interests? Like if you attend a competitive academic summer program for a college, will it help when applying to that college? So say, for example, you do the Johns Hopkins CTY program, the Center for Talented Youth. We actually have a blog post about that if you're interested in learning more what that is. But that's actually separate from the admissions office and the university at large, right? So when I'm referring to demonstrated interest, I'm referring to things that are offered by the admissions office at that college or university. Even if you've done a program outside of the school, that doesn't generally, in my experience, really help in terms of demonstrated interest of learning about the college as an aspiring college student. Just attending a summer program on a college campus and like eating in the dorms and the dining hall, eating in the dorms. Well, you probably did that too, and sleeping. But that's not something that actually the college really cares as much about, quite frankly. It's a great experience and you can articulate about how awesome it was in many ways. But in terms of counting as demonstrated interest, from my experience, that's not the case.
Yeah. I'm gonna quick screen share. I want to just make a quick FYI for folks on and then I'm going to answer another question. The video that I mentioned, the one on self-care, is on the YouTube channel. It's this one. It's the 6 self-care tips. Somebody asked a question about that. And then one of the ones that I talked about recently, I guess 6 months ago, was talking about should you talk about mental health in your college essay? Someone asked about that in a private message, and I wanted to just flag that for you. And that's something that we're going to be talking about a little bit more as the year goes on, more about mental health and how do you particularly should you disclose, and if so, how do you disclose? Somebody asked, should you really be emailing admissions people? Does a Michigan admissions person really want you emailing? Does it actually help? Again, it depends on the school. That common data set will give you a sense of that. But I think in my experience, it matters a little bit more for, yes, schools who track it. And oftentimes it's those smaller schools that are in the sort of like they're looking for candidates. When you go to the rep, for example, if you go to a college fair and you meet a rep and you ask, are you the regional rep? Meaning you read the applications for the place where they're meeting. That in that case, emailing that person, a person that you've met who's going to actually read your application, might help a little bit more. Whereas if it's a person if you're just emailing like undergraduate admissions at Michigan, maybe it gets to the person, maybe not, so it's like sort of making that a little bit more targeted. Now, do you have to go to a college fair in order to demonstrate interest? No, but it's just another one of those points of one of those things that you can do. Back to you, Tom, and then we'll give away a free book here.
Sure. So Kathleen asked a great question, which is, I'll put it in the chat. What if students are in a de facto tracking system in their school? Even though the AP courses are available, those courses are not really open to everyone. That's a really great question, Kathleen. And I know this was pretty quick in the beginning of the session. But I really want to underscore the context. It's a word that is like overused. It depends, and context matters, I'd say, are like 2 phrases that you'll hear anyone who works in college admissions or college counseling mention at some point. And what I mean by that is that colleges generally will be informed of policies like tracking that a school has, or AP or advanced course limits. There are certain schools where it's like, hey, our students are not allowed to take more than 2 AP classes per year. No one in college admissions is going to be, after seeing that information on a school profile or in a recommendation letter, or maybe the student decides to include information about that in their additional information section, just so that they're really 100% sure that there's as many spaces as possible for an admissions officer to understand maybe that barrier or that challenge when it comes to advanced rigor. But really, colleges, in my experience across the board, really do honor individual high school choices when it comes to things like tracking into advanced courses, if you transfer in from another school and you weren't able to. So that's something that can definitely be explained and contextualized through recommendation letters, the school profile that your college counseling team from the high school will send in along with your transcript, and the additional information section for the student to voice that in their own words.
I need another minute to find, because
I have more.
You have more? Great.
Yeah.
Go.
So
And
Darcy asks, for STEM majors, can you get away with 2 years of language because your schedule in STEM classes didn't allow for 3 and some were spent in internships? So Darcy, this is kind of a little bit of that. That's a little bit of that tension that I kind of mentioned earlier on of I understand you're really interested in STEM and you want to take all those classes and that's like your main thing. But it's kind of like if you want to still keep exploring and doing that, colleges getting away with just having two in general for a lot of more selective schools in particular is something that would be a conversation point for your candidacy, just being very honest, right? Because there are a lot of other applicants who are still pursuing great STEM experiences while also completing those general required or recommended courses that the college is looking for in all of their applicants. So I understand the desire to want to really lean in, and especially a lot of times you'll hear in the college admission advice and counseling world things like identifying a spike for yourself or a hook or a point. To be a pointy student is something that, increasingly there are a lot of colleges that, are like, oh, this student is like really into like ant biology and they've done all these really cool things in this specific area. And that's really interesting and neat and a great fit for our program. There are students definitely who look like that, but usually those students who are still being admitted to the school also have the course load that represents that breadth across the subject areas that the college still does want to see in students. Because most schools, maybe an institute of technology or a few schools who want to see here and there don't have as many core requirements that students need to complete. But in the US, it's still pretty much the norm that even if you're majoring in a particular area, you still usually have graduation requirements at the college across the board as well. So I know that maybe isn't the answer you want to hear, but I would still recommend either explaining why you made that choice, or maybe potentially thinking about, if you are a junior, maybe thinking about that language course so that way you have as many options as possible on your college list. I would hate for that to be the foot in the door piece not being open for you because of that.
Yeah, I love that phrase, the foot in the door piece. I'm gonna let you pick another one because I want to pick a number. Actually, Tom, pick a number between I don't know, 1 and 20. Sorry.
12.
12. All right, I'm gonna go down to the 12th row and bum 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 bum. Let's pick a student and we'll pick a counselor. So on the counselor front, we've got Allison DeMong, are you around? If you are, must be present to win. And then I'm gonna go 12 more. And let's go. I have S. Parker. Um, is that a person who is still here? You can let us know in the chat. Oh, you know what? I picked two counselors. Let's pick a student. Here we go. Do we have students? All right, let's just go parent. Here we go. Um, oh, people put emails, but didn't put in the full names. All right, let's pick. Here we go. Um, Chris Hands. I think that's your email address. Hopefully I'm getting somebody who's here. Um, I'm a parent. I'm a student. All right, I picked three people. If any of those people are present, let us know, and we will send you a free book because we have your email. We'll get your email. If none of those people raise their hand like I'm here, we'll pick more people. I have your book though. Okay, then don't worry about it. Tom, let's do maybe like two or three more questions.
Yeah, so there were several questions I saw in the chat about what are institutional priorities. I know that wasn't really a big part of this particular webinar, but we have lots of recorded webinars and content about this concept. I just put a link in the chat to a YouTube video featuring yours truly, all about different examples of institutional priorities from different colleges. As with many parts of the college process, like with the mission statements and the value qualities that I mentioned, and the course expectations of things that they want to see, it's really difficult to give you a list of all the institutional priorities for different schools because many schools are not necessarily super forthcoming about that. They're worried about students and families gaming the system and crafting applications that aren't really in alignment with their own actual skills or experiences or desires. And a lot of times, you need to be committed to an instrument or a certain academic area for multiple years of high school, and institutional priorities change with a certain degree of frequency. So you can't really plan that a certain priority will still be in effect when you're a ninth grader as when you're applying as a 12th grader, because the colleges is evolving and their needs are changing depending on lots of factors, right? So the YouTube video will go into more depth about what those priorities look like. There's also a really amazing blog that's very, very thorough and so beautifully written by, we shouted Susan out a lot in this session, well deserved. She's wonderful. And she wrote a blog about it as well. So that's something else that I think is a great piece, especially if you're a counselor, to send to students and families about, hey, you know, we want to encourage you to lean into the areas of the application where you have ownership and autonomy, and things like putting together a great application, communicating your values, showing that alignment with the school's mission are all action steps that you can take as a student. But it's also important just to be aware that there are things happening behind the scene that are out of your control that are influencing why certain students are admitted and others are not. I think that gives a degree of it takes away a little bit of that kind of like, I have to find a way to get myself in here piece that many students want to figure out the way. And it's especially because you don't know what the outcomes are going to look like in the end. It's really great to prime people ahead of time with the fact that it's not a personal decision and there's often a business component behind the scenes that's influencing whether or not they were a successful applicant. And it's not a personal marker of how talented or smart or how great their qualities are, or whether or not those are valuable or not, because a lot of times it is just a supply and demand issue.
I've got one, somebody asked from international students resources. I want to share with you a huge page of those. This is called our International Student Resources Hub. People are still joining for the session. I love that. That's awesome. So this is our college application hub for international students. Some ones that I want to highlight, because this can feel overwhelming, is some of these mistakes that international students make when applying to college. I think this gives kind of good case studies. This was written, a lot of this shepherded by Kristen Karovic. So shout out to her thank you, Kristen, for all the work you've done. And a big concern for some students is financial aid. So there's an awesome guide here, a step-by-step financial aid guide for international students. And some, more resources, how much it actually costs to go to school in the US. Some of these resources, you won't need them right now because it's not time to write your essays necessarily. But you'll find lots and lots of stuff in here. So I recommend that. And that you can just find by just Googling International Resource Hub College Essay Guy. All right, Tom, last one, bring us home, and then we'll let folks go. We've already lost Diana as our moderator. No shade to Diana, but she was like, guys, I gotta go. And we're like,
I gotta get out of here. Yeah. So I think the last question I can touch on is just about number of colleges to apply to. That one I think can be relevant to a lot of people tuning in. So can you talk about the optimal number of colleges you should apply to, 10 to 12, 12 to 15, or 20? I'm getting conflicting responses to this question. I generally like to say that for most US domestic students, again, we love individual support for students. So if you're able to do that, it is the best way to get a little more of a tailored response to your needs. But for the 353 of you who are on here, I'm going to try to give a general blanket statement that you can riff off of. Because the answer is it depends, right? I would say with the majority of students in the United States who are applying to, if you're particularly applying to a generally more selective application process, right? So maybe the majority of the schools that you're targeting or on your college list have an acceptance rate that's below 50%. Maybe a good quarter of them or a third of them even have acceptance rates below 30%, which is what I would call a more highly selective school or highly rejective. If you're in that category of student, I'd say around 10 to 15 schools is a general range that you want to maybe target, which will allow you to have, an even distribution, ideally, of likely schools where you're likely to be admitted, target schools where there's like a, half-ish chance that you might be admitted. It's a toss-up. And then a reach school, which is you should expect not to be admitted just because of the sheer math of how competitive that school is. But you're going to put your hat in the ring as a reach because you're really excited about it. And that's totally your prerogative, right? Sometimes students will have an approach called go big or stay home. Well, they'll decide, hey, I love my in-state flagship school. I feel very confident, and my Naviance chart or scattergram that my school is providing me is showing me that I'm a really competitive candidate there. I might just that will be where I go if I don't go into these other schools that are more highly selective. I wouldn't necessarily say that's my ideal list that I would recommend for a student, because I think it's very empowering to have a spectrum of options and explore different places. But if that's the way you want to go about that process, that is your prerogative. If you're an international student who's tuning in, that's where I would say you may, especially if you have high financial need, that's where I'd say you maybe want to apply to a wider range of schools, maybe 15 plus. The reason why is because financial aid and funding opportunities for international students in the US is very, very limited. And oftentimes it is more highly selective schools that have financial aid policies that meet 100% of demonstrated need or have special scholarships or programs to fund those students. So just because of the limited pool of schools that you have access to, if that's your financial situation, it is probably wise for you to apply to the widest range as you possibly can. So that way you are maximizing your chances as much as possible. But for US domestic students, ideally, you're not eating, sleeping, breathing, applying to various colleges, because that's a lot of essays to write. It's a lot of time and energy of a very exciting time in your life as a growing person in this world. So you want to make sure that the college process isn't completely dominating every aspect of your waking minute.
Well, even though we didn't get to every question, good news, we're just going to do another session next week, and we're going to have admission officers that you can ask directly questions of, Carlos from MIT and Hillary from Colorado College. So looking forward to having you all there. We love you. We're here. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.